Okay, so again, welcome. This is our class in the continuing series on chapters 4 and 5 of Master Shantideva. Let's go ahead and start, as we usually do, with some prayers. We begin with the praise, the homage to Shakyamuni Buddha that we recite 3 times. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And let's do the Mandala Offering. Again, we'll just do this in English. Try to visualize all the beautiful things in the world, everything that is in the world transformed into a beautiful paradise, a pure land. We're making this vast pure offering to the Buddha, all the holy beings, so we can realize the teachings that we're going through and quickly attain the state of Buddhahood. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta. Before the teaching, we'll do a short meditation on bodhicitta in a moment. But already while we're reciting this, cultivate those 2 thoughts, finding a safe direction in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, seeing that they are what protects us and all beings from all suffering. And then also recalling the motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here to listen to the Dharma, engage in these teachings, so we can become a Buddha and lead all beings to that same state. We'll do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gi pesanam ki dola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chanyan gi pesanam gi dola penshir sangye drupar shog. All right, let's do a short meditation then before we begin. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and then also to generate our motivation together. So find a good posture that works for you for meditation. And then when you're ready, you can begin to attend to the breath and just use whatever technique works for your mind to kind of work with the breath, stabilize the mind a bit. So if you need a suggestion, generally I suggest working with sensation in the area of the nostrils as we breathe in and out through the nose, that very subtle sensation that occurs in that area. But otherwise, just whatever technique you're working with the breath, just try to maintain your awareness there as best as you can. And then we have that factor again that is part of what we're discussing in chapter 5, our guarding alertness, our introspection, a spy in the corner of the mind that checks in to see what's going on. And in the context of our meditation, it's checking to make sure that we have mindfulness of the breath. And if we've lost that rope of mindfulness, then this sort of goad of introspection encourages us to restore it, to get back to the breath that we were focusing on. So again, use that as you can to keep the mind focused on the breath. And we'll do this for a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for tonight. So now let's turn our minds towards generating the best motivation for being here. And as you'll recall, in this chapter, we're looking at the perfection of morality, and we've begun our study of the first of these three types of morality, the morality of refraining from harming other beings. And this is really the foundation of our path, as well as, of course, the foundation of bodhicitta, of our motivation. And if we think about how we ourselves don't want to be harmed, we don't want others to inflict harm upon our bodies or say things to us that are untrue or harsh, that are slanderous. And we don't want to suffer. But it's the same for every single sentient being. They don't want to be objects of harm. And this is the core teaching of the Buddha in terms of morality, is ahimsa, this non-harmfulness, this wish to avoid doing anything that will cause being suffering. And as I said, this is also the root of bodhicitta, which is the exact opposite mind in terms of harming others. It's the wish to benefit others to the greatest degree. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, we should do our best to benefit others, but if we can't benefit them, at least don't harm them. So the bottom line is not to harm others, but bodhicitta takes it to the exact opposite extreme in terms of not just refraining from harming, but doing everything we can to benefit others, everything we can to develop our own qualities so we can then be of greatest service to other sentient beings. So with the understanding that beings are just like us and not wanting to suffer, not wanting to be harmed, and moreover, they're just like us in wanting to be happy, wanting to have true peace, we generate the mind of bodhicitta, whereby we will attain that state where we have developed ourselves completely. We will have attained perfect happiness. We will have removed all suffering and all the causes of that. But moreover, we will be in the best position to benefit all beings, to help them to attain that same state. So think that we're going to engage in this continued study of these three types of morality, to engage perfectly in the Bodhisattva's deeds as set out by Master Shantideva, so we can attain that state, our own enlightenment, so we can then lead others to attaining Buddhahood as well. Okay, again, so welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. So let me get us back into the text by pulling up the slides and get us to where we were when we left off last time. So again, we're in the main part of chapter 5. Recall that there was a little sort of introductory part to chapter 5 talking about the 6 perfections, these practices of a bodhisattva. The main part of the outline, of course, is the explanation of the verses. There are 109 verses. We are not quite halfway through those, but we're looking at the first outline explaining extensively how to practice, and then there will be a couple of additional verses to round out the chapter. Within explaining extensively how to practice, we're on the third outline, which has to do with the practice of guarding the mind with mindfulness and introspection. This is a good chunk of chapter 5, verses 34 through 97, that cover the 3 types of morality that are the 3 outlines for this section. So the 3 outlines within it are training in the morality of restraint, meaning refraining from doing harm, as I was saying in the meditation. Then we'll go on to the way of training in the morality of accumulating virtuous dharmas, how we actually create a counterforce of more virtue in addition to avoiding non-virtue, harming others, and so on. And then the third one that is really emphasized in the Bodhisattva path, the morality that accomplishes the welfare of sentient beings. It's dedicated to benefiting them, beings who are suffering, helping them, and so on. The very first outline within that, again, is the training in morality of restraint. This has 2 outlines within it. We've looked at the first one, which was called purifying the actions of the 3 doors. Now we're on to protecting the training of the 3 doors, protecting the 3 doors from degeneration. This has 2 outlines. The very first was protecting the training of the body from degeneration, and this had within it 3 outlines. The first outline was not letting the body fall under the control of distraction. So this was what we went into. We did this verse and the next one last time. So let's just look at those verses real quickly to kind of get us back into the topic that we're talking about here of protecting the body, meaning not just our physical actions, but also our verbal actions from degenerating. If I engage in a variety of senseless talk or in many kinds of spectacular shows, I should abandon attachment towards them. So this is talking about all the meaningless talk we might engage in, or the distracting activities that we do physically, Broadway shows, spectacular shows. Anyway, the idea that we can get distracted so much, and by virtue of that, frequently the training that we're engaging in degenerates. So we should abandon our attachment towards all of these various activities. Then whoops, I went the wrong way. The second outline is to abandon meaningless activities. So not just those that cause the attachment to arise, but also those that can become kind of meaningless for us. And we can even possibly engage in harming others by virtue of our not really having an aim to what we're doing. And in that verse, we touched on this at the end of last week. If for no reason I dig the earth, cut grass, draw patterns in the earth, and the like, then recalling the advice of the Sugatas, I should immediately stop out of fear. So again, these are some of the things that are set out within the bhikkhu training and the bhikshu and bhikshuni, the monks and nuns that are fully ordained. I don't know about all the other ordinations, but anyway, this is definitely a part of the vows, is to not engage in digging and so on. But even if we aren't ordained, if we're engaged in meaningless activities, Gyaltsab Je says, such as digging, cutting grass, drawing in the dirt, and so forth, then one should remember the trainings of the Tathagata, and being afraid of the shortcomings of one's actions, stop them right there. Because again, we might harm other beings through our actions, but we certainly kind of waste our time to some degree. You know, we're here to practice, to devote our lives to the Dharma as best as we can. Not that we won't have times when we engage in some things that might be more mundane and perhaps a little meaningless in that regard, but we can do some of those things with bodhicitta motivation. Here it's talking about just doing things that, you know, don't really have any particular aim or purpose. So now we are on to the third outline. This is where we left off last time, and this third outline has more verses, 47 through 54, and this is analyzing the motivation at the time of the action. So this is the idea that we have to also be attentive to what it is that we are doing in our minds, because we've been talking here in this section about body, meaning our physical and verbal actions, but obviously our mind is key, as it always is in Buddhist teachings. So this has three outlines. The very first outline is simply showing, kind of giving the summary of what this is about. Then we'll go into an explaining set of verses that are the bulk of this, and then there will be a summary. So the very first one, showing, Master Shantideva says in verse 47, whenever I have the desire to move or to say something, first of all, I should examine my mind and then, with steadiness, act in the proper way. So we've been seeing this come up in some of the other verses, right? You know, where there is this desire to first check up on in the mind and see what's going on. Before we do something physically or verbally, we have to be in touch with what's going on in our minds. So Master Gyaltsab Je says, and this is page 25 of Gyaltsab Je's commentary that I think many of you have. I don't know if you've printed it out, but anyway, he says, at the time when one wishes to move one's body or wishes to speak, one should first investigate one's mind to make sure it has not fallen under the control of the afflictions or self-cherishing. Recalling again that self-cherishing or the self-centered mind, we can call it an affliction because it's usually together with the afflictions, but it's a tendency that we have to be focused on ourselves and my needs and what I want. And so by virtue of that, we often neglect the needs of others. So he says, and then if if it has fallen under the control and so on, engage accordingly in what has to be practiced and what has to be abandoned. So this is always the role of our mind. And what we're calling here, again, throughout this chapter, that's called guarding alertness or introspection, the idea is that we have to have that force that is constantly looking at what's going on and adjusting accordingly to say, oh, I've lost my mindfulness of engaging in virtue and avoiding non-virtue. I have to correct it, because otherwise I'm going to get swept away. I'm going to end up doing things, saying things that I end up regretting, and that will be harmful to myself, but also, of course, harmful to others, which again is what the Bodhisattva is primarily concerned about. I mean, we do have to think about our own welfare, but it's in the light of being a benefit to others. So as I said, then the second outline in this section is explaining. This has actually 5 outlines. So the very first outline within explaining is what to do when one wishes to generate afflictions. So when we do see that that's going on, that the mind is moving in that direction, what do we do? And this is a very important verse to some degree. There's quite a bit in this when we actually look at it. Whenever there is attachment in my mind, and whenever there is the desire to be angry, I should not do anything nor say anything, but remain like a piece of wood. Of course, we've seen this piece of wood thing before, right? We saw it actually in this verse that I put in the slides, verse 34, which we looked at either last week or the week before. I think it was last week. When at the beginning, having known that such a mind is with fault, at such a time, like a piece of wood, I should remain, being able to rely upon the antidote. So I think it is important maybe we revisit that verse. We did have a little discussion towards the end of last week. I think it was Richard who brought up a point, and then George even brought up a point, or maybe Francesco, I can't remember. A number of you brought up points about kind of the differences between some of these ideas, and even the idea that we see in the verse number 3 of the 8 verses, which essentially says, when vigilant the moment a delusion arises in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay. So what is the real advice that's being given here? Is this concept of being like a piece of wood makes it sound like we just shut down, like we're a robot that the power's been unplugged on or something, and we just collapse. And I don't think that that's quite exactly what we mean. I think, again, he's using this idea of a piece of wood because a piece of wood is unmoving. It doesn't get drawn into things. It doesn't get attracted to things. It doesn't have revulsion for things. It ends up kind of just being okay with wherever it's at because it's not going to react. It's not going to fall into our habitual patterns. But there's a lot, I mentioned this last week, there's a lot behind the scenes of that. It's not like we just, shut down and stop the heart from beating and the blood from flowing and the brain from, working, and then we'll be fine. We'll just be like a piece of wood. We'll be like a corpse. That's not the point of it. The point is to work with our minds behind the scenes in terms of all of what needs to happen to keep the body and the speech unmoving, to keep ourselves from going in that direction. So I thought it would be useful, even though I'm trying to get, kind of not spend too much time on each of these, but to spend a little time looking at some commentary. First, going back to that verse 34 that we just looked at, and I didn't share this last week, Geshe Jumpa Tekchog in a commentary, oral commentary that he gave on this text many years ago. He said well, I think I missed a we in there. When we have to go somewhere or the other, if we think in this way and go, there is no fault. But if we think that way and go, it is faulty. First of all, we should think about our motivation. And this is also what we're seeing in verse 48, right? If we first of all check our motivation with vigilance, the antidote, so he's calling again in this context vigilance or introspection or guarding alertness, different names for this mental component that we have. This is the real antidote, the ability to check in, to see what's going on, not from just wanting to know that, but wanting to correct the mind, to move the mind in the right direction. So he says, if we, first of all, check our motivation with vigilance, the antidote, and come to know that it is faulty, that the mind is faulty, our motivation is faulty, then we guard the mind by bringing it back from that fault. So this is the role of this guarding alertness that we're talking about in here. Remember that it works in tandem with mindfulness. So if we set our motivation, our intention, and we have some mindfulness of that to begin with, but if that mindfulness strays because we get drawn into a situation and we lose our motivation, we lose being in touch with what it is that we want to do in a more virtuous context and avoid non-virtue in the light of this particular practice of morality. If we see that it's faulty through the force of our introspection, our vigilance, that is the antidote. That allows us then to correct it. Of course, we have to have something that informs that correction, and we're going to get into that a bit with some of the verses coming up. But look, verse 48, going back to that, again, Master Shantideva says, whenever there is attachment in my mind, and whenever there is the desire to be angry, I should not do anything nor say anything, but remain like a piece of wood. In other words, don't react from that place of anger or attachment, because that's our habitual pattern that leads us into non-virtue. And so we want to remain like a piece of wood in terms of not getting drawn up into things, not moving in that direction. So let's look at what Geshe-Jampa Tekchog says about verse 48, because I really liked his comments, and I hope you find them useful in going through this. And then we'll take a look at what Gyaltsep says. But he says, when we think attachment and anger are going to be generated in our minds, the signs and indications that they are going to arise have occurred, so that we know that if we do such and such an action, attachment and anger will definitely arise. So whether it is a physical or a verbal action, we should not do it at that time. So again, it's our introspection, our vigilance that is noticing these signs, noticing what's going on in the mind, checking in and seeing, because we know, in retrospect, we always have it perfect, right? Hindsight is 2020. After an incident where we've gotten caught up in an argument with somebody and we've gotten very angry, it's very easy after the fact to go, I know where I stepped in it. I know where I went too far. I know where I didn't have that. But if you're aware of it, and this is what Master Shantideva is encouraging throughout this entire chapter, if we have this alertness that is paying attention, that is checking in to see the quality of our mind, then as soon as we see the signs, as soon as we see that we're moving in that direction, when we start to get really defensive in the face of what somebody's saying to us, and we can feel the thoughts start churning and the movement in that direction in terms of something, we know if we keep going, we're going to say something or do something that we regret. Well, that's the time that we want to catch it at this. And I'm going to share with you, as part of tonight's presentation, some advice from Pema Chodron in her book on Master Shantideva's text, because she talks about kind of 4 points where you could catch it. Obviously, there are infinite points because it's a continuum. Our minds start off with just that little bit of unhappiness, and then we start moving in that direction in terms of anger. With attachment, it's a little bit of pleasure, happiness that we have, and then the mind goes in that direction and craves that, clings to that, and so on. But if we can catch it right here where it's happening, that's obviously the best, through our guarding alertness, to try to catch it wherever we can. Because obviously some of us may not have it yet until further down the road. We're already red-faced and in the argument, and then we go, oh my gosh, I've stepped in it again. I need to be more attentive to what's happening and try to do what I can to calm things at that point. But nonetheless, this is the process that we're looking at. This is what we're trying to get more familiar with in the context in this part of the chapter to how we avoid non-virtue, how we refrain from harming others, and by virtue of that, harming ourselves too. So Geshe-Jampa Tekchog says, for example, we might be thinking of going somewhere, but see that if we do, then anger and attachment are likely to occur. So you want to go out to, well, nowadays, again, can't get to a bar or a restaurant or anything, but say in the days of old, when we used to have those things that were there, you could go out to them, but you knew that, maybe because of the people that you were going to go with and the environment you were going to be in, that you knew that something was going to arise, that you weren't going to be able to guard your mind. So it says, so we see that if we do, then anger and attachment are likely to occur, or that by talking with someone, afflictions are likely to arise, then we should not do that physical or verbal action. We should remain, not move in the direction of things that will lead us down the pathway of non-virtue. Now, again, a lot of what we're talking about here, it seems like what Geshe-Jampa Tekchog's talking about might not be that harmful, but we know that we can get drawn into a lot of things that can become very harmful for both ourselves and for others. So then he says, when we think our mind is likely to move with the delusions, we should grip and take care of our mind with the antidote. The antidote, once more, being our vigilance, our introspection, this alertness that is attentive to what's going on and knows that we want to move in a different direction. And he says, and remain with a mind that is not moving like a piece of wood. So this is how he describes it really quite specifically. We're not talking again about that the mind isn't there at all. It's not moving in the direction of the delusions. As it said in the first line, it's, our mind is likely to move with the delusions. We remain like a piece of wood and keep the mind moving with the delusions. As a piece of wood is unmoving, he says, do not allow the mind to move on the side of the delusions. Hold it firmly. So I don't think, again, we go back to that verse 3 of Geshe Langri Tangpa's 8 verses of training the mind. I think it's absolutely in line with it. Because if we look at the idea that whenever this delusion begins to rise and we see the beginning signs of it, then we want to confront and avert it without delay. So again, you can add a lot of different antidotes to this. Obviously, when we talk about anger, when we get to chapter 6 on patience, there are numerous antidotes that we can apply, various thought processes that we can become familiar with so that when we meet a particular situation, we know exactly what it is that we need to avert our anger with in that moment so that it doesn't arise. But even just having the awareness of what's going on is sometimes enough, especially in lighter incidents, where things could move in a particular direction. Say you do go out with somebody and and you're sitting down over a meal and you know that this is a person who likes to do a lot of criticizing of various people, maybe political figures, maybe our president. But you know that you can get caught up in that very easily because you might share the same sentiment, but you know how quickly it can degenerate into saying all sorts of things that are maybe not so helpful. It's one thing to be critical and want to do something to change things. It's another to be critical just for the sake of hearing yourself go crazy with criticism and going out of control with a mind that just generates more and more hatred and malice towards the people who are objects of that. So again, if you know that, then you want to avert it. You want to do what you can. And Master Shantideva's advice in this particular chapter, in this section, is this idea of remaining like a piece of wood, not allowing the mind to move in that direction. That may mean that we do sometimes have to refrain from physical or verbal actions, but we're mostly, again, talking about our minds. Our bodies and our speech will follow wherever the mind goes. If the mind decides we're going to go out with those people and go and engage in that talk and we're going to succumb to it very easily, well, then that's a decision our minds made. We can't blame our body and our speech for ending up in that situation. So we want to remain unmoving as much as possible, not go in the direction that the delusions are causing us to go in. So this is the whole gist of this section in particular, is to use this analogy of being like a piece of wood to show how the mind should be at that time, and by virtue of that, frequently our body and speech being still. Because if the mind isn't moving in that direction, the body and speech are not going to follow. So then he says, this is going on to Pema Chodron's commentary, which I'm going to go through rather quickly, and you can look it up if you do have a copy. It was called No Time to Lose when it was first published. I think it's called Becoming Bodhisattvas now or something. It's republished by Pema Chodron and Shambhala Publications. She says, here Shantideva describes being on the verge of getting carried away. And as I said, she identifies 4 places where we can interrupt this powerful urge. But as I was saying, don't think that these are the only 4 places, but these are important road marks or stop signs along the way that we can potentially stop at and keep from going forward, or we might run through the stoplight and keep going. So the first one is at the pre-verbal level, before we've done anything. We haven't even necessarily started our thoughts about it. It's very early on in the process. The second is when thoughts are still small. When you've got the thoughts generating, because obviously what's feeding into our anger, our attachment, and so on, all the various delusions, are the thought processes we start circulating in our minds. The third is when they've already ensnared us, when we've kind of gotten caught up in the thoughts and we know the train has left the station to some degree. But there's a fourth point where it's just before we act out, just before we do or say something, that we can still catch it. So let's look at, I've inserted these numbers into here. She didn't have the numbers on hers in the actual text, but the first one, the pre-verbal, she says, emotional turmoil begins with an initial perception, a sight, sound, thought, and so on, which gives rise to a feeling of comfort or discomfort. These are the 2 poles that we vacillate between, and we have attachment towards what is comfortable, pleasurable, and anger or aversion towards what is discomfortable, uncomfortable. Discomfortable isn't a word. Uncomfortable, unpleasant, and so on. Energetically, there is a perceptible pull. And she calls this Shenpa. I didn't put this in here because it's a unique teaching that she has that she got from one of her teachers. It's this pull, this kind of getting hooked. She says it's like wanting to scratch an itch. We don't have to be advanced meditators to catch this, of course, but nonetheless, it's hard to catch it in the moment. We can actually begin to see it more clearly through meditation. But nonetheless, I think that the ability to be actually noticing that does take a great deal of focus and attention to what's going on in the mind. We do have to have a heightened level of guarding alertness, of this introspection that knows that, oh, I'm getting hooked right now. Something is pulling me in that direction. The initial tug of for or against, for the comfort, against the discomfort, is the first place we can remain steady as a log. Just experience the tug and relax into the restlessness of the energy without fanning this ember with thoughts, without, continuing to accelerate. You take your foot off the accelerator, you put your foot on the brake, and you just stay there and be aware of what's going on and don't go any further. The amount of energy it takes at this level is very, very light. To stop a car that's going 80 miles an hour takes a lot more energy on the brake than to just stop it when the car's begun rolling. So this is important to know, is that while it might be a little bit harder to distinguish when that's happening, the amount of energy it takes is very, very little. If we stay present with the rawness of our direct experience, she says, emotional energy can move through us without getting stuck. And then she does admit, of course, this isn't easy and takes practice to be able to do that, to be able to respond in a healthier way when that process begins. The second opportunity for staying steady and alert is when our thoughts are underway but haven't gained momentum. So here we've got our foot on the accelerator to some degree and we're starting to move forward, but we're not up to 70, 80 miles an hour. We're doing maybe 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. By interrupting thoughts before we get worked up, we diffuse the intensity of emotions. Emotional intensity can't survive without our thoughts. So this is a pivotal instruction. Again, what is feeding the whole process are our thoughts. If we diffuse them, if we cause them to weaken and disperse to some degree because we are attentive to that, and we can change our thoughts. Again, as I said, there are a variety of ways we change our thoughts or things we can introduce, but then we keep it from gaining momentum. We keep it from moving forward, and we can still put the brake on. Third, if we don't catch these subtle thoughts, our emotions escalate. We start pressing the accelerator more. Nevertheless, this is the third place we can remain like a log, like a piece of wood. We can let the storyline go even after the emotional heat has started to arise. It's never too late to interrupt the escalation of the kleshas, the afflictions. So again, this is a third level where you can still interrupt the storyline. You're not, totally under the control of that, but you do have to have some ability to notice it, of course. That's that guarding alertness, but then to introduce something that is much more powerful, a stronger force that will keep you from moving in that direction to where you do act and you do, say things that you're going to regret. And that's at the fourth place, just before that. At the fourth place, we can hold our seats. The fourth place we can do that is just before we take the fatal step of speaking or acting out. Shantideva addresses the stage in verse 48. His advice, do not act, be silent, do not speak. We didn't have those exact words. That's in the translation she's using. But we had that idea of do not do anything or say anything. That's the last place. If we don't catch it before then, when it's just a mental process, then at least catch it before you open your mouth or do something physically. The sooner we interrupt this predictable chain reaction, the better. At the pre-verbal stage of getting hooked, the first one, emotions are far less enticing, right? You don't have that kind of energy behind them yet. They are still quite workable at the early stage of the thought process as well. By dissolving thought here, the klesha urge has no fuel and can't expand or become explosive. It doesn't, become larger because we're not feeding it with additional thought processes. Whoops, sorry, two slides went. When you feel the sting of an insult, for example, you don't have to magnify it with your thoughts or buy into a storyline that works you into a rage. Just acknowledge the thoughts and let them fade away. It's just sounds that you're hearing that you don't have to react to. You don't have to entertain the thoughts that keep you moving down that road of anger towards the insult that somebody has, thrown at you. Then abide with the sharpness and bite of your experience. It's just an experience. It's just a feeling tone. It doesn't have anything to do with necessitating that reaction. The third point, if you do get stirred up and the drama gets well underway, you can still interrupt the process. It's definitely more difficult, as I was saying. It gets more difficult the further out you go, but it's possible. You do have to have a stronger antidote at that point. You do have to have more force behind your foot on the brake to keep the car from getting to dangerous speeds. The final instruction, to refrain from words or actions, point to the easiest place to notice the urge, but the hardest time to refrain. right? Because we notice it then to some degree. If we've got some awareness, some mindfulness, some alertness, we go, oh my God, I'm there now. I'm in full-fledged anger or full-fledged desire or craving. And we can notice it, but it takes a lot of energy at that point because you're already flying down the highway. Now the pull is so strong, it feels irresistible, right? You just gotta have to keep going. Nevertheless, the instruction remains the same. Let go of the thoughts and relax with the underlying energy. Still go back to that place of trying to get more in touch with things from a place of not needing to react, not needing to let all of the habitual thoughts come to the surface. Kind of get to a place where, again, we can introduce other thoughts as part of this. She doesn't talk about this in her commentary on it, but nonetheless, we would often say that that's, what's going on. And so what helps us to stop at that point are the other thoughts we can introduce. So the practice of remaining like a log, she says, is based on refraining, not repressing. When you realize that you're thinking, you just acknowledge that. Then turn your attention to your breath flowing in and out, to your body, to the immediacy of your experience. And I would say again, even to the thoughts that are more wholesome at that time, that are framing things in a more positive way. Doing this allows you to be present and alert, and your thoughts have a chance to calm down, to actually kind of stop moving forward and becoming stronger. So let me just talk about that a little bit again. I hope that was useful to share that. When I first read that many years ago, when I was reading her commentary right after it came out, it was helpful to know that these 4 kind of points could be set out. But as I said, it's a continuum. So we can stop it, of course, at any point in that process through having some guarding alertness, through having some awareness of what's going on. Kind of being our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe says, always checking in and going, oh, well, what direction are you headed in? Is this the right place for you to be headed? And is there something that you could do that would be more useful, more beneficial? And of course, if that's what the voice is that is informing that guarding alertness, then we have a tool that we can use. Recall that in the traditional way of talking about these two, mindfulness and introspection, in the calm abiding teachings, the shamatha teachings, where they have that little diagram of a road that goes up and there's an elephant that is being guided. The elephant is the mind. And at the beginning, the practitioner needs 2 things to keep the mind in track. One is the rope of mindfulness that you put around the neck of the elephant, that we hold our mind with so that it's still to some degree and doesn't go chasing after everything. But then there's the goad, and I mean, it's really horrible if you know what they do with this to elephants. It can cause them to bleed even because it's got a sharp point to it, and you goad the elephant to get it to move in the right direction. Well, this is introspection. This is, again, don't think about it in those violent terms. We're not trying to, harm ourselves through this. It's an aid for ourselves to get ourselves to move in the right direction, to be attentive to what's going on, that if we've lost our mindfulness, if we have lost our awareness of where it is that we're supposed to be, and that we've forgotten the instruction that we want to follow in terms of our behavior and avoid non-virtue in this context, then we have to correct it. We have to have some force by which we see what's going on and do what's necessary. And whether we're catching it way out in the, towards the end, when maybe even we're catching it after we've acted and spoken, that sometimes happens, right? Where you're all of a sudden you realize you're in the middle of an argument and you go, oh God, I stepped in it again. Here I go. I need to stop this. I need to remove myself from this. I need to stop it from moving further. Very hard to do then, because then you've got another person involved in it, right? And so the argument is very hard to detach from. But nonetheless, do whatever you can. Yeah, I was noticing certainly when I first started working on these teachings with way back in the Bay Area when I was living there, and I was driving, and I mean, traffic there was pretty insane. I know traffic's insane in all of our metropolitan areas as well as even some of the non-metropolitan areas, but you'd have things triggering you constantly, and you begin to become aware of it initially way after the fact. You go, oh wow, I just flipped that guy off, or I did whatever. And then you kind of say, okay, well then I need to do better the next time, and you do your work on the cushion and you inform your thoughts so that the next time maybe you're catching it when you've already begun the process, but before you've gotten to the culmination. And then you catch it in a little bit further, and then you catch it in a little bit further. And the goal is to have the awareness that's catching it right at the beginning. As Pema Chodron said, it's the pre-verbal, it's the even pre-thought, where you're not really having a lot of thoughts going on. You're having the sting of that insult or of whatever's going on, but you're not moving anywhere forward. You're keeping the mind from moving by having it remain like a log, remain unmoving. So I hope that was useful, because I mean, if we go through these teachings and you don't get any tools to work with, they're wonderful verses, but the whole point of them is to give you tools to work with in your everyday life to engage in these three moralities. This first one of refraining from harming others, from engaging in that type of morality of non-virtue. Refraining from non-virtue. So the second outline within explaining, recall that there are 5 outlines, is what to do at the time of mental excitement. Mental excitement is the mind that gets enticed by various things and wants to move in that direction. And this is generally pleasant things that we're after. So in verse 49, Shantideva says, whenever I have excitement, the wish to verbally belittle others, pride and arrogance, when I have the thought to describe the faults of others, cunningness, and the thought to deceive others, whoops. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that verse. Whenever I am eager for praise or have the desire to blame others, whenever I have the wish to scold and quarrel, at such times I should remain like a piece of wood. So again, while this talked about mental excitement in terms of those pleasant things to begin with, in verse 49, we have all these other times too, when we could have pride arising, we could have a tendency to point out the faults of others. We want that praise, we're attached to getting that. We want to blame other people. Again, a lot of things that are more in the vein of all the different distractions that we have. Here too, the advice, this universal advice, is remain like a piece of wood. Don't let your mind move in that direction, and have your speech and your actions follow. So here I did want to share a little bit more of Geshe Jumpa Tekchog. I only have a few more other passages for tonight, but on this one, these two, he says, when our mind is turning towards any of those, any of what we've gone through in this list, which again, Gyaltsep J in his commentary on page 26 has a whole bunch of bullet points. You know, when there's mental excitement or mocking the object, belittling others with jokes, being full of pride due to qualities, being conceited due to youth and other reasons, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's quite a few listed there. All these times when we have the potential for delusions to arise and for us to engage in non-virtue, he says, right from the start, we should remember the antidote, our guarding alertness that checks in to see, am I on track or am I off track? And stop them with it. That's the whole purpose of guarding alertness, is to say, okay, I'm going to put on the brake now. I'm not going to go forward. I'm realize where I'm going is not healthy, is not good for me or others. Thus preventing the mind from going to them, moving with them, not letting the mind go under the control of the delusions, keeping the mind like a piece of wood as above. So again, I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go through all of what Gyaltsep J says, because again, it was quite a laundry list of various times, but I think we get the gist of it. Whenever we see something that's going to pull us in that direction, we need the brake of our guarding alertness that sees what's happening and decides to stop, to not allow the mind to move forward. And again, by virtue of that, our body and speech to follow. In the third outline of these 5, what to do at the time of praise and so forth. So in verse 51, whenever I desire material gain, honor, or fame, recall that these are some of these 8 worldly concerns we looked at last week, right? Having material gain, getting praised, being famous, well-known, have a good reputation, when we want comfort and so on. The second line, whenever I seek servants or a retinue, people to attend to me, people to serve me, to be of benefit to me. And when in my mind I wish to be served, at those times, I should remain like a piece of wood. So again, the same advice, that when we're with these various urges that we might have, we have to stop the mind from moving in that direction. The fourth outline, what to do when one thinks about the welfare of others. Whenever I have the mind wishing to neglect the welfare of others and to pursue my own welfare, again, this being the heart of this mind of self-cherishing that was mentioned earlier, wishing to say something. At these times I should remain like a piece of wood. And of course, wishing to say something that will get us what we want, that is concerned about our welfare. So because we've neglected the welfare of others and we want to say something or do something that will help our own welfare to be met, at those times I should remain like a piece of wood. So here, a very short commentary from Gyaltsab Je, I will share this one. He says, when one considers the welfare of both self and others, and one casts aside the welfare of others, wishes to work only for one's own welfare, and has a mind wishing to speak, which again in this context means to speak, as Geshe Yeshe Tupten says in his commentary, speak only what creates gain for us, only what will be a benefit to us. We're not concerned about what will please others or what will help them. We're about what we want and what we need to get. So that's how our speech will follow. Such a person should remain like a piece of wood. Again, this constant refrain of staying like a log, like a piece of wood. I think in one commentary it was even like a tree. But I mentioned last week, I think a tree is a bit more active, and I don't know, a piece of wood sounds very pretty, stable. It's not going to move in any particular direction. So let's go back to the slides and continue looking at these verses. Then we have, following this, the fifth outline, the final of this section of explaining what to do when one wishes to generate anger or sadness. Whenever impatience, laziness, fear, and likewise shamelessness, remember we talked about shame or self-respect, not having that would be our shamelessness, or the talking of nonsense and thoughts of partiality arise, partiality being biases that we have towards various beings and what have you. At these times too, I should remain like a piece of wood. So here in Gyaltsab Je's commentary, he says, at these times, one should remain like a piece of wood while practicing the antidote, the guarding alertness that keeps us aware of what we are trying to do. The things at times he points out are when being impatient due to anger or to suffering. We're going to, of course, talk about this in chapter 6, the tools that help us to be patient. Two of the three types of patience. The first one is being patient in regard to harm that someone has inflicted upon us, which usually induces a mind of anger. The second type of patience being indifferent to suffering that we have to experience. Everyone has to experience a little bit of suffering. The aging of these bodies, getting ill, being separated from the things we like, and so on. Might not be other people involved in inflicting that harm. This is just part of living our lives. So this is the first time that he's talking about when being impatient due to experiencing anger at someone else harming us or the suffering that is just a part of our lives. When being afraid of practicing virtue and so forth due to laziness that is not joyful about virtue. Not about afraid of practicing virtue. It's more like we're not so encouraged to practice virtue. We're not kind of moving in that direction because we have laziness that is not joyful about virtue. Laziness is something we will be talking about in chapter 7 when we look at the perfection of joyous effort. That is the antidote to that laziness that doesn't take great delight in virtue. This is what we mean by joyous effort, taking delight and wanting to engage in virtue as much as possible. A third time when we want to remain like a piece of wood is when one is stubborn because of being unrestrained or incoherent. The fourth time, when the mind favors one's own side, friends and so forth, when we're looking at it from the point of view of once more our own things that we're attached to, the partiality we have towards our friends and towards getting what we want. So again, it's just this whole, these 5 sections, these various verses that we've been looking at are really demonstrating that it's at any time that, as going back to once more verse 3 of Geshe Langri Tangpa text, vigilant, the moment a delusion appears in my mind. He doesn't say the moment anger appears in your mind or the moment, laziness appears in your mind or the moment any particular one, any delusion, any problematic mind, the moment it arises in your mind. Seeing that it harms both oneself and others, that there is danger for both oneself and others, we shall confront and avert it. We shall do everything to keep the mind moving in that direction and remain like a piece of wood. So let's return. We're going to just have one more verse for this section. That's, again, the third section within this, the third outline, the summary of what we just talked about. And here in verse 54, Master Shantideva says, having in this way examined his mind for afflictions and for thoughts that strive for meaningless things, the hero, should hold his mind steady by means of the antidotes. So this is kind of interesting. In some of the translations, it just says antidote, and at that time, it seems to be referring once more to guarding alertness. That, if we examine our mind for the afflictions, once more, that line from Geshe Langritampa, vigilant the moment a delusion appears in my mind, having examined that what's going on, and for thoughts that strive for meaningless things, for any of the thoughts that kind of move us in a direction where we're not going to do something virtuous and meaningful with our lives, but rather things that will lead to greater harm and suffering for ourselves and others. The hero, of course, is the Bodhisattva. He or she should hold their mind steady by means of the antidotes. So we will see that in the very next section, there are a number of antidotal thoughts that are useful for us, and we're going to spend a little time on that as well, because it is important that we know what sorts of thoughts will help us to move the guarding alertness in the right direction. If we see what's going on, then we know very quickly by recalling these various antidotal states, various forces of mind that move us in a more virtuous direction, we'll be able to avoid non-virtue. So again, looking at this training in the morality of restraint, we have just finished then the first outline within that. So it has two outlines. We're now moving on to the second outline. The very first outline was called Protecting the Training of the Body from Degeneration. And so, yeah, I think that was the one. Let me go back. It's further back. It's purifying the actions of the three doors, I think. No. Protecting the three doors. Protecting the three doors from degeneration. I'm sorry, I went back with these. I don't know why I put so many slides in here. This is actually where we were at in terms of the second outline within it. The first one was purifying the actions of the three doors. Now we're in the second outline, protecting the training of the body from degeneration. This was what started on page 25 of Gyaltsep J. We were in the first outline of that, which had to do with protecting the training of the body from degeneration. Now we're protecting the training of the mind from degeneration. These are the last few verses on this first of the three moralities. We're going to look at kind of, we've frequently talking about the body and the speech, but obviously, as I was saying, you can't detach the mind from those. So a lot of what we talked about there was not having things happen physically or verbally, but through the force of being aware of what's going on in our mind. Now we're going to look more specifically just at the mental qualities that we need to have to keep the mind from degenerating, to keep our minds in the right direction. So this is where, like I said, there are two verses that go into how we protect our mind with the individual antidotes. So let's look at this idea of antidotes quickly before we go back to that. Sometimes we do see antidotes being introduced in the Lam Rim texts. I think it's actually in the middle scope, the scope that has to do with how we achieve or have the motivation to achieve liberation, our own individual freedom from suffering. And there are oftentimes a discussion, and actually in Geshe Sopa's wonderful commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo, he goes into in the last part of that second, I think it's the second volume, the second volume of Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. He goes into a whole discussion of these various antidotes that we often call the temporal antidotes. And I even discussed some of those earlier in this course, I believe, where if we see attachment arising, for example, we might bring to mind the antidote of focusing on the undesirable qualities of the object that we're attached to. Because what attachment is doing is it's painting the object entirely good and delicious and delightful. And that's the only thing it's seeing. So if at that time we introduce a more balanced view of it, the attachment doesn't arise because it doesn't have anything to feed it. It's lost its fuel. So there are those kind of specific temporal antidotes that we often talk about. That's not what's going to be talked about in this section in terms of antidotes. What we actually look at in this section, and it's kind of an interesting list that Master Shantideva gives us in these verses, is the number of things that inform our having this guarding alertness, inform our ability then to move in the right direction at that time. And a lot of these are virtuous mental factors that can be very useful on our spiritual path. Some of you may have studied Lorik, Minds and Mental Factors, and you'll recognize a number of these. Remember how I talked about shame and embarrassment, what I call self-respect and consideration for others as being virtuous mental factors. We're going to see some of that return here in this verse 55 in particular. Verse 55, Master Shantideva says, being very resolute, this is one quality. one antidote, and faithful, having great confidence and faith, being steady, respectful, polite. By polite, we mean having a healthy consideration of others and not wanting to do things that upset them, with a sense of shame. Remember, shame again that I prefer to call self-respect. This mental factor that is very useful in our practice, keeping us from going astray by being attentive to our own views of our awareness of our own behavior and how we want to live up to greater ideals. Fear. Fear is here in a very positive context. It's not a negative fear, an unwholesome fear. Pacification, ability to pacify the senses and so on. We're going to see these coming up as we go through them. Being kind of having all those various qualities that are all very virtuous by way of how we are applying them in this situation. I should strive to make others happy. It's kind of an interesting ending to this thing. I mean, you might think it would say, I should strive to be like a log or something, or like a piece of wood, or I should strive to refrain from harming them. But, essentially, we do make others happy by not harming them. We do make others happy by being like a piece of wood and not reacting to everything they say or do. So here, what I wanted to share, and I actually shared this earlier on. I shared it last week, I think, because there was in His Holiness's commentary, A Flash of Lightning in the Dark. He doesn't have all the verses, and so sometimes he's commenting on verses that aren't even there. And I think this was actually a commentary on verse 55 that we just had up on the screen. So let's go over it again with that in mind. And I've added some parenthetical information as well as bold-faced a few of the things that we talked about here. He says, it is important to be sure of our practice, clearing up all doubts and making certain that we understood everything correctly. That's because, once more, all of our behavior is rooted in wisdom. I mean, I found this really interesting. Venerable Rabina just concluded a week of teachings with us, here in Santa Fe. She wasn't here physically, but it was for the Santa Fe Center. And she was talking about this concept, and I never really thought about it so much, but it really is quite true. She says, that Buddhism really stresses this idea that our ethics is very firmly rooted in wisdom. In a lot of other spiritual traditions, we might have ethics that's bound up in a belief system. That if you have a theistic tradition, for example, it's that Moses came down from, the mountain with 2 tablets with the 10 commandments. These are the word of God, and God as your creator says, that you shalt not kill, and you shalt not this and that, and so on. All these various advice, maybe stronger than advice, rules by which people who have that belief in a God are supposed to abide. So there's not much kind of wisdom involved in that. Obviously, a lot of the things on the list are similar to what Buddhism says, but Buddhism takes it from the approach that we're looking at a wisdom that informs our ethics. That if we actually deeply understand the teachings, which of course the first 2 scopes of the Lam Rim. Here we're in the 3rd scope with all of the teachings of Master Shantideva. We're looking at the greatly capable being, the person who wants to become a Buddha for the sake of others. But that's informed by the middle scope, the middle capable being who's intent upon achieving their own liberation through taming the delusions and completely removing them. And then, of course, the small scope, the person of the least capability who is informed by the teachings on karma. If we don't have that wisdom of understanding karma, understanding the process by which we are reborn, understanding how the root of all of this is ignorance and how we need to remove it through the wisdom realizing emptiness and so on, if you don't have everything that informs that, there's not really a good understanding for your ethical behavior in Buddhism. Your ethical behavior is because, first of all, you want that first level of refraining from harming others because you see that it harms you. The second level is that you get that there's the deeper afflictions that are behind all of that you also want to remove because that's the deeper cause behind all the things that you say and do that are harming other beings. And then we finally get to the 3rd level where we practice good morality, not just because we don't want to suffer, but because we want others to not suffer and we want to be of greater benefit to them. So when we start seeing it through that lens of having wisdom, our understanding, inform our ethical behavior, inform our morality, then this is quite revolutionary to some degree. And I actually appreciated that she pointed that out because I think it is an important point of Buddhist ethics. So again, this confidence in the practice has to be based on clear reasoning and faith. Remember how faith was one of them in the previous slide. Let's look at that, being very resolute and faithful. So then the next one being resolute, I took that word determination to mean that, being very resolute, very determined, based on having informed our minds with the teachings. We have a great confidence in them, so we have that faithfulness, but we also have a resolute quality that we are determined to move in that direction, to follow the Buddha's teachings as they are set out in the Lam Rim and the stages of the path. And stability, His Holiness points out, that steadiness, that ability to kind of remain with things and not, kind of move away from where it is that we want to be, but have an ongoing effort to remain with things, to be very steadfast and stable. And a respect for the practice we are doing. Again, recall how those being steady and respectful were a part of that second line. Then he continues, he says, our actions should be guided by our own conscience, a sense of shame, which once as I like to call it self-respect, is a factor, a virtuous mental factor that keeps us from moving in unwholesome directions because we know we need to do better. We know we want to live up to ideals that we have for ourselves. And then by concern for what others might think. That's what I'm inferring by the word polite in that verse, being steady, respectful, polite, with a sense of shame. Polite here is an interesting word. I mean, polite, we learned how to be polite when we were kids, right, to our elders and what have you. But the idea is that if we are really concerned about what others might think and what others might do on the basis of our behavior, then that's being polite to them. That's being considerate of them. That's why I usually call that other factor, instead of embarrassment, I call it consideration for others. Having concern for what others might think. That's also one of the virtuous mental factors. And then by dread of the consequences of negative actions, which in our verse was fear, right? We had it with a sense of shame, fear, and pacification. So the idea here is that we do have to have still the awareness of that our negative actions have consequences. This is obviously something that informs deeply our guarding alertness, because we see that if I go down that pathway and follow that mind of anger, follow that mind of desire and attachment, there are going to be consequences. And those consequences don't just ensue for me. I can even have fear of the consequences for others. When I don't have a mind that is tamed, well, then I have my speech being out of control, and I'll say things to others that harm them, and I'll do things to others that harm them. So keeping our senses under control, this is the meaning of pacification, not being so caught up in everything, as Venerable Rabina says, being like junkies born into a world of junk, that we just get addicted to everything around us. We have to have a somewhat pacified mind that's not getting drawn into all the sense objects. Let us be peaceful and try to make others happy. So now that I read this in the context of, again, because it wasn't demarcated with a particular verse that it was associated with, there was a huge jump from like verse 33 to, or 32 to verse 56 or 57. 55 wasn't even listed. But 55 is really a very important verse because it points out to us the various things that our minds need to be informed by. We have to have this resoluteness, this determination to continue on our path that we've been studying and know the details of intimately, a deep faith and confidence in those teachings through our own investigation and our experience. Maintain that steadiness, that stability, be very respectful, again, of others as well as the teachings and so on. Be polite to others, considerate of them, have a sense of our own respect for ourselves, a fear, a dread of the things that will ensue if we follow that path, and pacify ourselves from getting so drawn up in all the things that are in this wild world that can draw us in the wrong direction. You know, based on that, I should strive to make others happy. What my motivation as a bodhisattva should be in all of my actions is to make others happy. So Geshe Jumpa Tekchok says, when we think in this way, through those various things that Master Shantideva introduced us to, our mind will become calm and subdued. We will not feel jealous of others when they are practicing virtue and helping others. This is a way to make our mind peaceful, a method to use right from the beginning when the delusions are about to arrive to stop them from arising. When the strong manifest delusions have arisen, it is very difficult to stop them immediately. He's saying something very similar to what we saw Pema Chodron saying, right? What would be good would be if we could think in this way before things have gone that far. when they are about to come up. Again, because if we can catch them then, the force isn't so great that we need to put against them. If we do not habitually have this way of thinking, our mind will be subjugated by the delusions. It will lose control to them, and we will finish by doing things that we should not. This is the whole gist of this chapter, again, is to keep us from going in those directions. And once our mind has gone under the control of the delusions, when they have come up in our mind, they will motivate us to engage in evil deeds of body, speech, and mind without our being able to help it. They will be what's in charge. We won't have the rope around the elephant mind. The delusions will be holding the rope, and they'll drag us in whatever direction that they want us to. Our body and speech, he says, are the ones controlled, and our mind the one controlling. So if our mind has a good motivation, we will see good actions of body and speech. And if our mind has a negative way of thinking, our actions of body and speech will be bad. This is completely fixed for the most part. Therefore, and this is the kind of touching, the final emphasis, the exclamation point. Therefore, these lines, verse 55 in particular, contain the method for preventing our mind from being controlled by the delusions. So again, we're going to go back to 56 in just a moment because that's also part of this section, this outline. But verse 55 gives us all the thoughts that are behind it. And when I was answering last week's questions, there was maybe again that we could look at the idea of being like a piece of wood and think that it means that there's just this blank, still nothing going on. But there's actually a lot that's informing what we're doing at that time. These factors of faith and determination, of having a resolve around the teachings, having our shame and our self-respect and our consideration for others, having all these things of fear, a dread of where the action's going to go, all these inform it so that when our alertness sees what's going on, when our introspection sees, we're going astray, and especially if we can catch it right up front, as Geshe Jumpa Tekchok says, then it's done its job. All of the teachings have informed what we're doing, and we have that wisdom that we can bring into our ethical behavior that keeps us from going in those directions because we know that there aren't good consequences if we do that. So I think it's, again, some very powerful parts of this chapter, in particular coming up in these verses, in 55 in particular. 56 is once more in this same outline, which was called Protecting with the Individual Antidotes. And here Master Shantideva says, I should not be disheartened by the whims of the childish who are in discord with one another. So the childish are those who, again, don't have the knowledge, just like when we talk about children in the world, they generally are not as intellectually informed as adults are. There are exceptions to that, obviously, but children are defined as such because they're still unformed in a lot of ways in terms of their thinking and what have you. So the childish are the people who don't have the information, the knowledge that the wise ones do, that the sort of adults in this context do. And again, the childish, those beings who are caught up in their samsaric delusions, they're in discord with one another. They're not, doing what really needs to be done. So I should be merciful with them. I should be compassionate with them, thinking this mind of theirs is due to the generation of afflictions. We're going to see the same idea introduced in chapter 6, right? Because we have that whole idea of the patience that is not retaliating to others who harm us. Well, if we see them through that lens, that, the reason why these beings are in such discord, why they're doing these things, why they're saying these things, all the various faults we can find with, sentient beings around us. Not that that's our job spiritually, is to pick out everyone else's faults, but they're a mirror of faults we have, but we can certainly see that that's arising because of the degeneration in their own minds. That's the real enemy again. We're going to see some powerful teachings in chapter 6 on that if we have that view that the real enemy are the delusions and the afflicted states of mind and sentient beings. It's not the sentient beings themselves. Sentient beings themselves, we should have mercy for, we should have compassion for, because they're being wielded by their delusions in the same way that, a stick is being wielded by somebody who's hitting us over the head with it. The real enemy is the delusion in the mind of the person who's wielding the stick, not, the person themselves. So let me read a little bit of what Gyaltsab says in this, because he does have a little bit, and I might reiterate some of the points that I made in verse 55, as well as elaborating a bit on verse 56. For 55, he says, how to protect the mind, : strongly ascertain the points of advice by abandoning doubt and wrong consciousnesses with regard to them. So again, that's that idea of gaining some definite conviction in the teachings, the determination or resoluteness. Generate strong faith through belief in the three jewels and the points of advice, faith and aspiration. So that we need to generate faith and the aspiration that comes from that faith. Faith is this very virtuous mental factor that has different qualities to it, but the most kind of solid one is this faith of conviction, a convinced faith that through our investigation of the teachings becomes absolutely certain of the integrity of the teachings. So faith isn't a blind faith at all in Buddhism. Some people may come to it initially with a bit of that, oh, I like the Dalai Lama and I like Buddhas and they look kind of cool and whatever, and they just have a belief that there's something good there that isn't grounded in reality, grounded in experience. But faith in Buddhism is very much about finding conviction in the three jewels because you've come to see the Dharma as valid. You come to understand the validity of it through your own experience. After faith and resoluteness, then he goes on to say a stable intent and practice. Again, that steadiness, that continuing to do it again and again and again, relying upon that. Fourth, being polite by being respectful and humble with everybody. So he kind of included respectful and polite in that same thing, how we relate to others. Shame, that is fearful of negativity by reason of oneself, or this self-respect, as I call it. Being afraid of the ripened result by contemplating the shortcomings, so having that fear, that dread of the consequences of my actions. Having pacified senses, we call that pacification, not allowing our senses to go out of control. And striving for the purpose of making others happy. He includes it there as kind of a thought we have, but we saw in the verse, it's kind of the conclusion. If we kind of put all of those in place, well, then my thoughts at those times that my guarding alertness is informed by is the intention to make others happy, to benefit them, to not harm them. Because if I have a thought of benefiting them, if I have bodhicitta in my mind, I can't possibly have the thought of wanting to harm them. Those are opposites. So it is interesting, in Pema Chodron's text, as well as another commentary that I have from the Nyingma tradition, they actually say that this is already moving us towards the practice of virtue, the second of the three types of morality. But nonetheless, it can be included here because, as I mentioned previously, you can't practice avoiding non-virtue without it being virtuous. And whenever you're engaged in virtue, you're not engaged in non-virtue. You're keeping yourself from having non-virtuous thoughts or actions towards others. Then verse 56, do not be put off by the contradicting desires of childish people, where, having benefited one, the other one gets angry. Sometimes we see that in our world, right? We benefit one person, and then the other person gets upset because we help them because they don't like that other person, and so on. The whims of childish people, the whims of people who are under the control of their delusions. Have compassion for them, he says, thinking, this mind is generated within them due to afflictions, and without them having any control over themselves. I will liberate them from their afflictions. Again, feed it back into our bodhicitta motivation, our wish to make others happy, to benefit them. In such a way, he says, do not fall under the control of the afflictions. This was page 28 of Gyaltsab commentary. And then he kind of goes on to have a quote from the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, by thinking how they are without power due to constant faults, possessing the mind, constant faults possessing the mind, do not hold it against beings. Seeing that it's because they're under the control of these delusions. It's not the being's fault, it's the delusion's fault. And if sentient beings had the tools to be able to work with their delusions, they wouldn't be under the control of them. And then there is a verse that I did put into the slides that is in Gyaltsab on page 29. And this is from Aryadeva, who was a disciple, a student of Nagarjuna, who wrote the 400 stanzas. Ziggy, our classmate over in the master's program, translated this. Just as a doctor does not fight with patients who are possessed by spirits, even though they are angry, so the Muni sees the afflictions, not the persons who are involved with the afflictions. The enemy is the afflictions. So this is a verse that could very well be, put into the context of chapter 6 when we get to that and working with patience. But when we see somebody who's, possessed by spirits, or let's say in our modern day, say somebody who's taking a medication that makes one very irritable, and they do have some medications that can induce that sort of state of mind. Or if your mother, your dear mother, was, under some mental fault that was going on, something in her brain that was causing her to be very aggressive and angry, you would still love your mother. You would still love this person because you see that it's a temporary fault that is there. It's not who the person really is. So the Muni, the Buddha, sees the afflictions as the enemy, not the person persons who are involved with the afflictions. Towards those with continuous thoughts to harm my body, life, and resources, and who speak unpleasantly to me, may I have exceptional mother-like love for them. So these verses are again from the longer commentary by Abbot Dr. Geltsen that Ziggy translated. But the thought goes on from there. It's not just again seeing the afflictions as the enemy, but we want to have this exceptional mother-like love for them, really wanting them to be happy. By my generating the pure exceptional resolve in my continuum, the mind of enlightenment that cultivates cherishing others, without a long time passing, may the state of unsurpassed enlightenment be bestowed. Again, another very powerful concluding thought to this. By this resolve in my mind to not harm others on the basis of the afflictions that they're demonstrating, but rather to cherish them, to benefit them, to want to become enlightened for them, that this will ripen into our own enlightenment quickly. Let me go ahead, and I know it's getting close to our finishing time, but there's only 2 more verses to finish this section. I want to make sure we get through them, but hold on to your questions or comments if you do have them. We're now in the second outline within this idea of the protecting the training of the mind from degeneration. Recall that that's the second outline within this first type of morality. We have the second outline has to do with the common antidote. Well, what's the common antidote to all the afflictions? The wisdom realizing emptiness. We often call this the ultimate antidote. So even here in chapter 5, the concept of emptiness gets introduced. Having control over that which is actually not misdeeds in myself and other sentient beings, I should always hold my mind like an emanation without an I, without a solid sense of self. There's a better translation of this in my estimation. This was Ziggy's, but I love Ziggy dearly. But this one, the first line's a little confusing to me. So I went to a translation that came from the oral commentary that I've been quoting from tonight, Geshe Jumpa Tekchuk. He translated there verse 57 as, in doing that which by nature is not unwholesome, both for the sake of myself and other sentient beings, I should always hold my mind fast, acting like an apparition with no sense of, again, this solid self. So the idea behind that first line in this one is that we do have things which by nature are unwholesome, what we call natural misdeeds, and we even have what we call stipulated or formulated misdeeds, which the Buddha, decided would be wise for people to avoid, but they aren't by nature unwholesome. Of course, one of the main ones that people know from the 5 lay vows, the first 4 of the lay vows are all natural misdeeds. It is a natural misdeed to kill another being, to steal from another being, to engage in adultery or other forms of sexual misbehavior that are harmful. It is also a natural misdeed to lie to other beings, meaning by their very nature they are harmful. But the 5th one is to avoid alcohol and intoxicants. Well, that's a stipulated misdeed. If someone has a drink, there's nothing non-virtuous about having a drink or smoking a joint or whatever it is that you do. But the idea is that those are in the stipulated misdeeds and part of our 5 lay vows as well as monastic vows because they're the doorway through which misbehavior can come. Non-virtue can arise often because of the influence of these factors on our minds. And there are many stipulated misdeeds. The things we saw earlier around the not digging in the dirt and things like that, monks and nuns who take those vows also have to refrain from that behavior. There's nothing non-virtuous about digging in the dirt. But there is a possibility that one could engage in non-virtue by way of doing that. So again, these are stipulated misdeeds. So with that context, again, it's just to explain it so that you have the full meaning of this particular verse. In regard to that, Abbot Dr. Geltsen says, engaging in virtuous qualities that are without natural or stipulated misdeeds, so in other words, being free of those in our behavior, the purpose of which is to be empowered over oneself, not degenerating and benefiting other sentient beings, I should always hold my mind steady, by means of being conjoined with the wisdom realizing emptiness, without the pride that arises on the basis of that false sense of I, the arrogance that we can have that is infused by that false sense of self, as though things are illusions, as if we're creating illusions and emanations. I'm not going to go into detailed explanation of this. Most of you have teachings in emptiness previously. But the idea is that we do start to see things as illusory because they don't exist in the way that they appear. They appear to be self-established on their own, but they have none of that at all. The self in particular, the I, the person that we cling to so tightly, we think it is so real. But it's just an apparition. It's just a hallucination. It doesn't exist in that way at all. And so this is the idea, is to unite all of our refraining from misdeeds with that awareness, that wisdom realizing emptiness, because that is the final, the ultimate antidote to all of our delusions and all of our negative behavior. The final verse of this section, verse 58, is in the last outline, the way of training in meditating on the antidote. So Master Shantideva says, by thinking again and again that after a long time I have obtained the supreme pleasures, thus I should hold my mind as utterly unshakable as Mount Meru. So seeing that we have attained this perfect human rebirth that's complete with the supreme leisures, the 8 leisures or freedoms, the 10 endowments. Now that we've attained this after who knows how long in the lower realms, I should hold my mind as unshakable as Mount Meru, keep it from moving in the direction of non-virtue, having that morality of restraint. So here, Gyaltsab Je says, think, after a great climb which lasted for a long time, I have finally attained the precious human rebirth with freedoms and endowments. By contemplating repeatedly the great purpose and rarity of the precious human rebirth, generate the intent to definitely achieve the great purpose, meaning enlightenment. Then firmly hold that mind as immovable as Mount Meru. So then there's a verse that is quoted in this is from the Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen's commentary, but it's actually from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. If you and the world wish to attain unsurpassed enlightenment, its roots are the mind of enlightenment, firm like the king of mountains, like Meru. So this is this idea behind what we're trying to develop, is this steadiness within our bodhicitta, this firmness that is also against informed by all the various factors that we talked about that make our guarding alertness, our introspection very, very powerful, so that we then can be attentive to what's going on in our minds and correct the behavior before it falls into non-virtue. This is this first of the 3 types of morality. Kind of the final advice is, make the mind very firm in that way. And that way you'll be very attentive to what you are doing and can correct accordingly. Being like a piece of wood, not moving any further, and introduce as much as you can wholesome states of mind. That is going to be where we go next week when we talk about the second of these types of morality, the morality of gathering virtue, engaging in virtuous dharmas. So any comments or questions from anybody? I don't see anything in the chat box. If anyone wants to add a comment or question, you can unmute your mic and join in.
Hi, Don.
Yes, Richard.
Hi.
Hi.
This section is, I found, extremely beautiful and helpful, and I've been following along with the Padmakara translation, and the translation of 55 is very, very beautiful and slightly different. And just wondering if I can share it. Would that be okay?
Yeah, please.
It says, with perfect and unyielding faith, with steadfastness, respect, and courtesy, with conscientiousness and awe, work calmly for the happiness of others.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a remarkably beautiful way of putting it. And you know what I mean? It's just kind of encapsulates it, but in a different way, and kind of speaks to the sense of wonder of the whole thing.
Yeah, there are times when if I'm teaching on this, not like outside of the basic program, I often go to that translation because it's much more poetic in my estimation, frequently. Not all the time, but frequently. Yeah.
I guess I respond to that. So, but it's a very beautiful, the whole section is very beautiful and very helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the same translation that Pema Chodron has. So she modified it a little bit for her own word usage and things. Occasionally she tweaked it, but yeah, no, and I think this is important. You know, there are so many translations of Shantideva's text. The very first one that I was aware of, I bought back in, San Francisco when I first started studying Dharma, and that was Stephen Batchelor's, and it was very, it was good at times, but there were other times where it was maybe a little shaky. But nonetheless, it was like the first chance to really read these amazing words of wisdom. But then since then, there have been so many different translations, and so it is important to find something that works for you. So thank you for bringing that up, Richard.
Yeah,
Uh,
the translation we're using is very good too. It's just that it's interesting to see these differences. And
yeah.
this one was particularly striking, I thought.
Good, good, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else, anything to share for tonight before we conclude?
Hey,
Yes, Lynn.
Don.
Hi, Lynn.
Thank you for the teachings. Hi, Don.
You're welcome.
They were really beautiful. Thank you. And I just had a question about, I think the word that, how do you work with not denying your emotions and changing the thinking process around it? Do you see what I mean? Because, for example, like there are times where I will sit in analytical meditation, and I'll feel what emotions are coming, what I'm sitting with, and what the narrative is that's going through my mind. And I know 90%, they're all illusions, but for the most part. And then, it's if I don't listen deeply with what's going on emotionally, then I don't feel like I'm getting at the root of that narrative that is more delusional than the others, that's causing me more suffering. If I'm too quick to discount or
Dismiss them. Yeah.
dismiss, or perhaps it's avoiding, then I don't feel like I'm going deep enough to really get the teaching behind it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's trying to sort of understand, like, what's the balance between working with the affliction in such a way that you really sink into it and understand it and learn it, or not, and you just say, oh, here it goes again, and separating oneself from it.
Sure. Well, I think, again, it's going to depend upon where we're at in our own individual practice. So there's no blanket answer to that type of question, because I think there are some of us, again, that will need to be very, very attentive to that, because that's the real learning. The learning is going to take place when we become our own therapist and just keep asking ourselves questions about, well, but where is that thought coming from? And where is that thought coming from? And keep investigating what's behind the emotions. Because again, the emotions themselves, in Western psychology, of course, emotion is a pretty big bucket and includes a lot of stuff. But in terms of the afflictive emotions, as we describe them, the kleshas, they're thought processes, and they need to be deconstructed. So for a lot of us, again, that is the initial work, is to really, well, the initial work, of course, is way back on the beginning, where we just do try to keep us from acting out on a lot of this stuff till we can do the deeper investigation. But once we're on our cushion and we're doing meditation, if that's the focus of that meditation, I guess this gets to be one of the issues too, is that they often say that even if you have virtuous topics that come into your awareness while you're meditating on something else, well, that's a distraction, because even though it's virtuous, it's taking you off of what you were intending to do. So say you are dedicating a particular time of your meditation to calm abiding, to focusing single-pointedly on a particular object, then it is important at that time, even when things come up that might be good for you to investigate, to say, oh, wow, this emotion's coming up and I could really learn a lot from deconstructing that and picking that apart. At that time, that's distraction. You don't want to go there. You want to keep with your practice that you've determined that you're going to do for that time period. But when you do sit down and you want to spend time focused on that, then it can become very rich. And then it becomes an investigation. Venerable Rabina uses this phrase that she says someone else, she even said it this weekend in her teachings, that someone else said this to her, that being a good Buddhist doesn't mean that you're sitting there all kind of calm and everything's just perfect and peaceful. Being a good Buddhist means having your hands in your own shit. And that's the investigation stuff. It's like to see, oh, wow, where's this emotion coming from? And what are the thought processes? How can I take it apart so I can understand what it is that I need to do in place of that? What thoughts will inform my mind better at that time so that I don't keep going down that same pathway. And then we have a tool that we can work with throughout our day whenever that arises, because that emotion isn't going to only arise when we're on the cushion. It's probably also going to arise many times during our day. So again, it really depends on where you're at and what type of practice you're doing. But obviously, if you've worked with it for a while and it becomes very easy to kind of squelch it by just having a little bit of a thought of, oh, I know I need to move in a different direction. I know that there's a more positive thought. Then the emotion isn't so strong and we can work with it. But initially, we're going to mostly deal with pretty heavy duty stuff, a lot of shit that we need to get our hands into and work with to understand so that we can take it apart. And so again, there's not a set answer. It depends on where we're at individually with our own practice.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me see if there was, yes, Andrea.
One thought that I think you mentioned dissolve, and you, Lynn, asked about like suppressing. And somebody told me the other day, don't get involved. It was in Portuguese. It was não te envolva, dissolve. It's like, it's about dissolving. So if you change, and it made me think a lot about like, okay, I'm not suppressing, I'm just dissolving. It's not important. So that's one thought. Based on what you said something about that, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, and this word of dissolving, I guess we'd have to define what that means. I mean, there was, even in that verse we just looked at, that's the ultimate antidote. There's a bit of that dissolution of the self that we want to be familiar with through our familiarity with emptiness, where we kind of recognize that there's no target. The target that we keep setting up of this solid self, that we keep having these reactions to, the comfortable, pleasant things and the uncomfortable, unpleasant things. All of that's based on having this target that we're setting up, the solid sense of self. And if we have an ability to dissolve that, or to even dissolve other things in the space of emptiness, I think that's a very powerful tool. I'm not sure if you mean dissolving in that context, or if you have another way that you're referring to that.
No, I'm working with it, but I think it's more of the idea of dissolving the anger. You know, like I got angry at Dawn.
Okay.
Because Don didn't, bring the flowers. Remember the other talk? And it's like, okay, but Don didn't know he was supposed to bring, and I have to work with that idea of my anger. That perhaps if I dissolve or I just let it go, whatever. But that was not my question. My question is just quickly on making others happy, and I think that's also like not. If the other person is childish and you recognize that they're unable to see what they're doing, they're never going to be happy, right? So then as a Buddhist, you kind of have to recognize that it's their path, correct?
Well, again, to use the phrase, they're never going to be happy, it doesn't speak to their Buddha nature. They will be happy at some point, but in the moment, sure, and maybe even in this life, maybe even in this life, because they have such strong, heavy, negative tendencies, they might not find that path to happiness in this life that is a real happiness. They'll get temporary happiness here and there, but again, I think that we still want to maintain that attitude. Even though we know that might not be a possibility for that person, we still treat them as if, they do have that potential for sure. So we want to treat them as if our intention is to help them to have that happiness, to continue to be a guiding force in their life as best as we can, to use control of our own behavior as an example for them, to do whatever we can to influence them in the most positive way. But there are obviously beings that we simply won't be able to reach. I mean, I sometimes joke about this idea, back when ISIS was doing those horrible videos that they were releasing of people being decapitated, and all this really awful stuff. And I mean, I might look at those beings and go, oh, I feel so sorry for these people that are under the control of their delusions, that they're able to do something that horrific, right? But that doesn't mean I'm going to get on a plane and go to, Syria or Iraq or wherever ISIS
and give your head.
And go, I want to talk to you about your delusions and how your delusions are leading you to engage in non-virtue. I mean, it's just not going to be so helpful. I'll be the next video,
No, thanks. Right, so there's an acceptance, even though you're doing your best,
Yeah.
then you can be attached to getting the feedback of their happiness. You gotta let go, right?
Yeah, and recognize that, again, temporal happiness is only so good if we can contribute to their temporal happiness. Well, wonderful, then be involved in that. Again, not unwholesome happiness, the happiness that comes from having people decapitated who you don't
Right,
like.
right.
Obviously we have to have limits on that, but help others to the best that we can. Yeah.
Got it.
Good. Thank you for that. I think we need to wrap up for tonight then. If you do have some additional questions or comments, please write them down and we'll have an opportunity. I often don't open it up to questions until a little bit later after I've done a little bit of a lesson on the verses, but keep them handy and we will get to them at some point. So let's go to the prayers and do our dedication prayers for tonight. Very important part of our practice, right? To make sure that we seal all of the virtue that we've created in the best possible way. We can even bring to mind the idea of emptiness within this. Everything is sealed within emptiness. There is no inherently truly existent I that is dedicating, no merits that we are dedicating existing in that way as sort of independently, inherently, intrinsically existing. And even the result that we're dedicating for, complete enlightenment of ourselves and all beings, this too is empty of any intrinsic or independent existence. Let's recite this verse, dedicating merits in that way. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then recalling that this very powerful mind of bodhicitta is what's going to get us and all beings to the perfection of our being, to the state of complete enlightenment. We want that mind to grow deeply within our own hearts and within the hearts of all beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And seeing how we depend upon our guides in order to fulfill this path, to get to the conclusion of this path, we make strong prayers for their good health and long lives, especially for these two teachers, but also for all other spiritual guides in this world. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then quickly, let's dedicate for anyone else that we're holding in our hearts, whether it be general categories of people like those who have died from COVID-19, those who are dealing with the illness now and possibly dying, all the people on the front line, medical workers, all the other essential workers, all of those who are experiencing hardship due to this or fear, what have you. We can make that very general dedication, but also bring to mind those specific beings who you know who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who have died or who are dying, and dedicate for their welfare, thinking that through the force of what we've done here tonight, may they be free from their suffering and may they find all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through all of our efforts. Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Don.
Again, please stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Samati.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Okay. I will again be